Welcome to History in Ashes, where we dive into the moments of history that most textbooks rush through, the ones that still whisper through our present. Tonight, you and I are going back to 1994, to one of the darkest and fastest genocides in recorded history. Imagine this. In just about 100 days, somewhere around 800,000 human beings were murdered. That means thousands of people every single day, often killed not by soldiers on a distant battlefield, but by neighbors, friends, even co-workers. And as shocking as this is, the world mostly watched from a distance, hesitated, and debated while the rivers of Rwanda quite literally ran red. Before we go any further, take a breath and settle into your blanket or your favorite chair. This is not going to be an easy story to hear, but it is one worth knowing. Because history is never just about the past, it lingers. The echoes of what happened in Rwanda in those 100 days still shape how nations respond to crises today. But let us pause for a moment. I would love to know where you are joining from and what time it is as you are listening to this. Go down to the comments and tell me. Are you in a quiet room late at night, trying to drift off to sleep? Or maybe sitting somewhere on a rainy afternoon? And if you have not yet subscribed to History in Ashes, consider doing so now. Because if you do not, you might leave me here like one of those abandoned UN peacekeepers, hopelessly waiting for reinforcements. To understand how Rwanda reached this point, you have to go far back, decades before 1994. Rwanda was a small, green country of rolling hills, a place where most people farmed the land, and the divisions between Hutu and Tutsi were not always as sharp as we might think today. They were less like separate races and more like categories tied to cattle, wealth, and status. A Tutsi might be a cattle owner, while a Hutu worked the soil, but people could move between these groups. It was the arrival of European colonial powers that froze these categories into something harder, something written into identity cards that would one day be used to decide who would live and who would die. First came the Germans, then after the First World War, the Belgians. The Belgians looked at Rwanda with the cold eye of colonial efficiency. They measured skulls, drew up charts, and decided that Tutsis, being taller and thinner, looked more European and were thus more fit to rule. They favoured them in schools and administration, turning what had once been a flexible social distinction into a rigid ethnic hierarchy. This favouritism created resentment, and resentment, when given enough time and enough fuel, turns into something dangerous. By the time Rwanda gained independence in 1962, Hutu leaders had begun to rise up, calling for majority rule. Their message resonated. The Hutu made up the majority of the population, and they wanted the end of Tutsi privilege. In the years that followed, thousands of Tutsis were killed or forced to flee the country in waves of violence. Those exiles, many of them children, would later grow up to become the fighters of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the group that would play a major role in ending the genocide. But that is skipping ahead. The seeds were already sown long before 1994. Ordinary people were being taught to see each other not as neighbours, but as enemies. The radio would soon begin to call them cockroaches. Teachers kept lists of ethnic identity in classrooms. Politicians used fear of the other as a way to unite their followers. And slowly, a country that had been described as a place of 1,000 hills turned into a place full of 1,000 warnings, most of which the world ignored. Imagine for a moment living there in those years. Imagine waking up to the sound of the rooster and thinking about your beans, your cassava, your children's school fees. And then imagine hearing on the radio a voice telling you that the people next door, the ones you share a fence with, are secretly plotting against you. How long before suspicion begins to creep in, before the idea that maybe you have to strike before they strike you begins to take hold? As we continue, we will look deeper into how the divisions between Hutu and Tutsi were widened, not only by politicians, but by everyday forces like school teachers, priests, and local bureaucrats. History is not just shaped by kings and presidents. It is shaped by the quiet, unnoticed decisions of thousands of ordinary people. And that is where the story really begins to feel chilling, when you realize how normal it all seemed, right up until it was not. And so, as we step into the next part of this journey, ask yourself this: what does it take for a peaceful neighbor to become a killer? What pressure? What fear? What push over the edge? If you want to understand the Rwandan genocide, you have to linger for a while in the years before independence. This is where the slow machinery of division was built, one law, one policy, one census at a time. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Rwanda was not the place of widespread hatred it would later become. Hutu and Tutsi lived alongside each other, spoke the same language, shared the same religion, and married across group lines. The categories were as much social as they were ethnic. Wealthier Hutu could become Tutsi by acquiring cattle, and poorer Tutsi could become Hutu by losing them. There was inequality, yes, but it was not absolute. Then came colonialism, with its obsession with classification. The Germans arrived first, taking over Rwanda as part of their East African empire, but they never dug very deep into the social structure. They were more interested in taxes and order than in changing Rwandan society. After Germany's defeat in the First World War, the League of Nations handed Rwanda over to Belgium as a mandate territory. It was under Belgian rule that things began to shift dramatically. The Belgians brought with them the tools of European anthropology and eugenics, tools that were as dangerous as any weapon. They believed that physical features revealed something essential about a person's character and capabilities. They decided that Tutsi, being taller, thinner, and with narrower noses, were somehow more noble. Hutu, shorter and stockier, were painted as peasants destined to serve. It sounds absurd now, but these ideas shaped real policies. The Belgians placed Tutsi in positions of administrative authority, educated them preferentially in mission schools, and left Hutu with fewer opportunities to rise. Perhaps the single most dangerous move the Belgians made was the introduction of identity cards in the 1930s. These little pieces of paper froze the categories of Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa into law. You could no longer shift your identity through marriage or cattle ownership. You were what the card said you were. And in a future moment of crisis, those cards would become death warrants. By the 1950s, the resentment that had been simmering among Hutu began to boil over. Hutu intellectuals began to organize, forming political parties and publishing manifestos calling for the end of Tutsi dominance. The Tutsi elite, for their part, began to demand independence from Belgium, but Belgium shifted its support to the Hutu majority, sensing where the wind was blowing. This set the stage for a bloody transition. The so-called Hutu Revolution of 1959 marked the beginning of open, organized violence. Thousands of Tutsi were killed, and tens of thousands fled the country into neighboring Uganda, Burundi, and Congo. Many left with nothing but what they could carry. Those exiles became a generation in waiting, children growing up in refugee camps, dreaming of returning to the land they had been driven from. Imagine for a moment what it would have been like to be one of those children. You would grow up with stories of home told over smoky fires, with names of hills and streams you had never seen, but which you were told were yours. And you would also grow up hearing stories about how your relatives were killed, about neighbors who had turned on your family. You might even hear that you had a duty to go back one day. You would wait, you would train, and eventually you would fight. Inside Rwanda, the new Hutu-led government after independence was trying to create a new order, but building a new country is not simple. power struggles broke out between political factions. Massacres of Tutsi flared up again in 1963, 1973, and later. Each time, thousands more Tutsi fled, deepening the exile community. Those who remained were often barred from certain schools and jobs, marked as different in their own homeland. What is chilling is how ordinary this all looked on the surface. Identity cards, school quotas, political pamphlets, none of these are dramatic on their own, but together they shaped a generation's understanding of who belonged and who did not. And when crisis hit, those ideas became the logic of killing. By the late 1980s, Rwanda was facing an economic crisis. Coffee, one of its main exports, saw its global price collapse, and farmers who had once been able to scrape by found themselves in deeper poverty. The government began to lose popularity. And when a government loses popularity, one of the oldest tricks in the book is to find a scapegoat. Tutsi, already marginalized and easy to identify thanks to those decades-old identity cards, became the convenient target. But it was not just about politics. It was about fear. Fear that the exiled Tutsi would one day return and take revenge. Fear that they would take land from Hutu farmers. Fear that the balance of power would shift again. Fear is one of the most powerful tools in history. It can turn a neighbor into an enemy faster than reason can calm things down. The government and its allies began to use the media, especially radio, to spread propaganda. Newspapers carried cartoons depicting Tutsi as snakes or insects. The language was dehumanizing, and once someone is no longer seen as fully human, it becomes easier to imagine hurting them. Think about how slow this all was. There was no single day when Rwanda suddenly turned hateful. It was a long drip of division, a steady drumbeat of messages that said, "You are different. You are dangerous. You do not belong." By the time the 90s arrived, Rwanda was a country full of dry tinder, just waiting for a spark. And that is where we will go next. The moment when the spark came, when one event turned years of resentment and propaganda into open killing. But before we get there, ask yourself this. How many times in history have we seen this same pattern? Division, fear, economic hardship, scapegoating. Can you think of other moments where this has happened? By the time the calendar turned to the early 1990s, Rwanda was a pressure cooker. The divisions we talked about earlier were no longer just social and political. They had hardened into something dangerous and explosive. The government was under strain. The economy was faltering. And on the borders, a new threat was emerging. The children of those exiles from decades earlier had grown up and formed a fighting force called the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF. The RPF was mostly made up of Tutsi who had been living in exile in Uganda, where they had fought in wars, trained as soldiers, and gained real combat experience. They were disciplined, organized, and determined to return to Rwanda, not just as refugees, but as victors. In October 1990, the RPF launched an invasion across the border, catching the Rwandan government by surprise. This was not just a skirmish. This was the beginning of a civil war. President Juvenal Habyarimana, the man who had been in power since 1973, reacted by declaring a state of emergency. He appealed for help from France and Belgium, who quickly sent troops to assist the Rwandan army. The RPF advance was pushed back, but the invasion had changed everything. Now the idea of a Tutsi threat was no longer just propaganda. It was something people could point to. And here is where the fear really began to take root. The government used the invasion as proof that all Tutsi were traitors. Even Tutsi, who had been living peacefully inside Rwanda for generations, were now viewed with suspicion. Lists were drawn up, lists of people who might be enemies. Militias began to form, small groups at first, but they would later grow into something much more deadly. It is worth pausing here to think about what daily life would have felt like in those years. Imagine living in a small farming village. You wake up to the sound of church bells, the smell of smoke from cooking fires, children playing in the dust. Outwardly, life seems normal, but then there is a roadblock on the way to market. You are asked for your identity card more often. You hear rumors about Tutsi rebels hiding in the hills. You hear the radio saying that they are coming to kill you, that you have to be ready to defend yourself. Slowly, the rhythm of life begins to feel different. The early 90s were also a time of political change. International pressure was forcing Habyarimana to allow multi-party politics. Opposition parties began to form, challenging his rule. This should have been a moment for democracy to take root, but instead it became another flashpoint for violence. Some of these new parties began to align along ethnic lines. Politicians who could not win on ideas found they could win on fear, by telling Hutu that if they did not stand together, the Tutsi would take over again. The most extreme of these voices began to talk about finishing the work that had been started in 1959. It is chilling to think about. The genocide was being discussed openly years before it happened. Meanwhile, the RPF continued to fight from the north, launching attacks and then retreating back into Uganda. Each attack fueled more propaganda. Each government crackdown on Tutsi civilians fueled more RPF determination. It was a cycle feeding itself, pulling the whole country closer and closer to the edge. And then there was the media. Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, often just called RTLM, began broadcasting in 1993. At first it played popular music and sounded friendly, but slowly it became a platform for hate. Its announcers mocked Tutsi, calling them names, spreading rumors, and eventually openly encouraging violence. Imagine driving your car or working in your fields while a radio voice in the background tells you who your enemy is, day after day after day. That kind of slow psychological conditioning is one of the most powerful forces in history. In August 1993, a peace agreement was signed in Arusha, Tanzania, between the government and the RPF. The Arusha Accords were supposed to bring peace. They promised a power-sharing government, the integration of RPF fighters into the national army, and the return of refugees. The United Nations even sent a peacekeeping mission, UNAMIR, led by Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, to help oversee the process. But peace on paper is not the same as peace in reality. Many in the government and military did not want to share power. Extremists saw the accords as a betrayal. They began to accelerate their preparations. Militias like the Interahamwe trained more openly. Weapons were stockpiled. Machetes by the truckload were imported. Propaganda became even more urgent, telling Hutu that time was running out. And the peacekeepers, they were too few, with too little authority. General Dallaire repeatedly sent warnings to the UN that something terrible was coming. He even sent what is now called the genocide facts, warning that lists of Tutsi were being compiled and that a mass killing campaign was being planned. The response he received was to stay within his mandate, to observe but not intervene. It is one of the most haunting things about this period, how many warnings were missed, ignored, or politely filed away. The world had the information. It knew the country was a tinderbox, but no one seemed ready to act decisively. As the year 1994 began, Rwanda was full of tension. There were killings and massacres here and there, enough to terrify people but not enough to force international action. The peace process dragged on, but the sense of dread grew. People whispered about something big that was coming. And then, on the evening of April 6th, 1994, a plane carrying President Habyarimana was shot down as it approached Kigali. Everyone on board was killed. Within hours, roadblocks went up across the capital. The lists of names were brought out, and what had been years of simmering fear and preparation turned into an explosion of violence that would engulf the entire country. So here is the question as we pause at this moment. If you had been living there on that April night, hearing the news of the president's death, what would you have thought? Would you have believed that the peace process was over? Would you have been afraid of what might come next? Or would you have thought, as so many people did, that this was just another crisis in a country that had seen so many before? On the evening of April 6th, 1994, the sky over Kigali was quiet. The air was cooling after another hot day, and most people were settling in for the night. Then came the sound, an explosion, then another. A plane had been struck as it prepared to land. The aircraft carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana and the president of neighbouring Burundi crashed in flames near the Kigali airport. There were no survivors. Within minutes, word spread through the city. People switched on their radios. Telephones rang. The country held its breath. If you were sitting in your house that night, you might have thought first about the danger of civil war starting again, the fighting between the Rwandan government forces and the RPF rebels. But within hours, something even worse began. Roadblocks appeared on the main streets of Kigali. Soldiers and militiamen began stopping cars, checking identity cards. Certain names were pulled from vehicles. Some were shot on the spot, others were dragged away. The first targets were not just Tutsi, they were also moderate Hutu politicians and journalists who had supported the peace accords. These were the people who might have stopped the coming wave of killings, the ones who might have called for calm. By dawn the next morning, they were dead. The Prime Minister was murdered along with her Belgian UN bodyguards. The leadership that might have resisted the genocide was being systematically eliminated. Imagine waking up the next morning and hearing on the radio that the president was dead, that traitors had killed him, that everyone must stay inside. Then imagine hearing a voice telling you that it is your duty to go to the roadblock, to check who is passing, to report suspicious neighbours. Imagine seeing your neighbour, a man you have greeted every day for years, now standing at the barricade with a club in his hand, deciding who lives and who dies. The killings spread from Kigali to the countryside with shocking speed. It was as if someone had thrown a switch. Everywhere there were roadblocks, on highways, on dirt roads, even on footpaths through banana groves. People could not move without being stopped. Those with identity cards that said Tutsi were often killed on the spot. If you tried to run, there was nowhere to go. Rwanda is a land of hills, and every road out of town had someone waiting. The weapons were simple: machetes, clubs, spears. Guns were used, but most of the killing was up close and personal. This was not some distant, industrialized killing like the trenches of the First World War or the gas chambers of the Second World War. This was face to face. It was neighbor against neighbor, teacher against student, even family members turning against each other. The radio became the most powerful weapon of all. RTLM called on listeners to work, which was the code word for killing. It gave instructions, where people were hiding, which roads to block, even naming specific individuals to be hunted. The broadcasts were chillingly casual, mixing pop music with jokes about killing, as if it were just another part of daily life. And here is where you start to see how years of propaganda paid off. Many ordinary people who might never have thought of killing before now believed they were defending themselves, their families, their country. They were told that the RPF was about to take over, that every Tutsi was a potential spy, that if they did not act now, they would be the ones killed. Fear can do terrible things when it is given direction. Some people resisted. There are stories of Hutu families hiding Tutsi neighbours, of priests and nuns who sheltered those in danger, of ordinary men and women who refused to pick up a machete. But these stories were the exception. The pressure to join in was enormous. Those who refused could be labelled traitors and killed themselves. Churches and schools, once considered safe places, became killing grounds. People fled to them seeking protection, only to be surrounded and slaughtered in the thousands. In some cases, local officials even organized the massacres using the registers of names they had kept for tax and school purposes. The United Nations peacekeepers tried to hold their positions, but they were outnumbered and had no mandate to use force except in self-defense. After the killing of the Belgian peacekeepers, Belgium withdrew its troops entirely, reducing the UN presence at the very moment it was most needed. Foreign governments evacuated their citizens, but left ordinary Rwandans to their fate. Imagine the feeling of abandonment. Imagine knowing that the world could see what was happening. The journalists were there, the peacekeepers were there, and yet no one was coming to stop it. Imagine lying on the floor of a church, hearing gunfire and screaming outside, and realizing that no one would come through those doors to rescue you. The first few days of the genocide were the most chaotic, but they set the pattern for what was to come. Killings became organized, systematic. Local administrators were given quotas. Militias went house to house. Bodies were left in the streets, in rivers, in mass graves. And yet, even in those darkest hours, there were moments of courage. Some UN peacekeepers stayed, risking their lives to protect small groups of civilians. Some priests refused to hand over those who sought refuge. Some neighbors lied at roadblocks to save the lives of people they knew. The country was plunging into darkness, and it had happened almost overnight. The genocide had gone from rumor to reality in a single evening, and now it would continue for weeks. As we pause here, ask yourself, how would you have reacted in those first hours? Would you have hidden, fled, tried to protect someone? Or would you have joined the crowd at the roadblock, convinced you had no choice but to obey? And just a reminder, if you have not subscribed to History in Ashes yet, now is a good time. Because without your support, this channel might go as silent as those radios after the last broadcasts in 1994. If the first days after April 6th felt like chaos, what came next was something colder, more systematic. The killings spread like fire, but they were not just wild mob violence. They were organized, directed, and shockingly thorough. What began as roadblocks in Kigali became a blueprint for the entire country. Across Rwanda, local government officials held meetings, gave orders, and distributed weapons. In many areas, they went house to house, calling people to gather for security meetings. Once the crowds assembled, they were told to go out and kill. Imagine being summoned to the village centre by the very same official who normally handled your taxes or land disputes. Imagine being told that it was your civic duty to go out and destroy your neighbours. The scale of the violence was staggering. In some towns, thousands of people were killed in a single day. The rivers became choked with bodies, so many that they floated downstream into neighbouring countries, carrying the evidence of the genocide beyond Rwanda's borders. Soldiers and militias used every tool available: machetes, grenades, rifles, farm tools. The most common weapons were not guns, but simple blades. It was brutal, slow, and personal. And all the while, the radio kept broadcasting. RTLM became the soundtrack of the killings, giving encouragement, playing music, making jokes about death. The announcers named hiding places. They mocked victims. They told killers to keep going. Imagine turning on your radio not to hear news, but to hear a neighbour's name called out, to hear instructions on which hills to search. In the countryside, Tutsi families fled to marshes and forests, trying to hide. Some dug pits and climbed inside, covering themselves with leaves. Some hid in ceiling rafters for weeks, surviving on whatever scraps they could find. But the militias were persistent. They searched house by house, field by field, pulling people out of hiding. What is striking about this phase of the genocide is how quickly it became part of daily life. Roadblocks were manned day and night, not just by soldiers, but by ordinary villagers. People who had been farmers and shopkeepers just days before now spent hours checking identity cards, dragging people away. It was as if the entire country had been turned into a killing machine. And still, the international response was hesitant. The UN peacekeeping mission had been drastically reduced after the murder of the Belgian soldiers. General Dallaire pleaded for reinforcements, warning that a full-scale genocide was underway. The world debated the language. Was this a genocide or just a civil war? The legal definitions seemed to matter more than the lives being lost. Some of you listening right now might be wondering, why did no one intervene immediately? Why did the world not stop this? The sad truth is that international forces had no appetite for another African intervention. The memory of Somalia, where US soldiers had been killed the year before in Mogadishu, was still fresh. Politicians feared a repeat, and so help did not come. In the meantime, the killers grew bolder. Churches, once sanctuaries, became slaughterhouses. People gathered inside hoping for safety, but militias surrounded them and attacked. In some places, grenades were thrown through windows. In others, bulldozers were used to tear the buildings down on top of those inside. There were moments of quiet resistance. Some priests and nuns tried to protect those under their care. Some ordinary Hutu villagers refused to kill, hiding Tutsi families in attics, under floors, or in the bush. These acts were incredibly risky. Those caught could be killed alongside the people they were protecting. But the pressure to join in was immense. The killers sang songs together as they went from house to house. They were told they would be rewarded with the property of those they killed: land, livestock, furniture. For some, it was not just fear that drove them, but greed. If you are still with me in this story and have not subscribed to History in Ashes yet, do it now. Because just like those few radios that kept broadcasting truth in the middle of all that hate, we need your support to keep telling these stories. Without it, channels like this go silent, and history gets forgotten. Back in Rwanda, the killing went on, day after day, week after week. The Interahamwe militias became more efficient. Local officials coordinated attacks. It was not just mobs running wild, it was a system. Historians have compared it to an assembly line of death, except here, the workers were farmers, students, shopkeepers, and teachers. And still, there were those who resisted. There are accounts of people walking miles at night to find food for those they were hiding. There are stories of bribes being paid at roadblocks, of forged identity cards being made to save lives. These stories remind us that even in the middle of horror, there were flashes of humanity. The world did eventually begin to pay attention, but very slowly. Television crews began to arrive, showing images of piles of bodies, of rivers full of corpses. But instead of sparking immediate intervention, much of the early coverage focused on the civil war between the RPF and the government forces. The genocide was still being described as tribal violence, as if it were some spontaneous eruption of ancient hatred rather than an organized campaign. Meanwhile, the RPF offensive was continuing. As they advanced, they liberated areas and stopped the killing there. But the government responded with even more ferocity in areas still under its control. It was as though the killers were racing against time, trying to complete their grim task before the RPF could stop them. As we end this section, imagine what it must have been like to live through those weeks. The smell of smoke in the air, the constant sound of gunfire and shouting, the fear every time you heard footsteps outside your door. How do you keep going in a world where death is everywhere? How do you decide whether to run, to hide, to resist, or to join in? By the time the genocide was a few weeks old, Rwanda had become a country divided not just by ethnicity, but by survival itself. The killings were no longer chaotic. They were organized, timed, and directed with precision. If the first days had been frenzied and confused, this phase was systematic, as if the entire country had been turned into one coordinated operation. Roadblocks became the most chilling symbol of this phase. They were everywhere, on paved roads, on dirt paths, at village crossroads, even outside hospitals. Ordinary people manned them, often under the supervision of militia leaders. At each one, identity cards were checked, names crossed off lists. If your card said Tutsi, you were often killed on the spot. Sometimes you were taken away, never to be seen again. Imagine what it meant to approach one of those roadblocks. You could hear them before you saw them. The voices of men, the clink of bottles, the sound of radios playing music or hate speech. You might see a log or a pile of stones blocking the way, a rope strung across the road. You would have to stop. There was no way around. You would have to take out your identity card and hand it over, watching their faces as they read it. If they let you pass, it meant another day alive. If they did not, it could all end there. These roadblocks were not just tools of murder, they were tools of control. They slowed movement, trapped people in certain areas, prevented escape. They allowed militias to coordinate their killings, to keep track of who had been eliminated and who was still on the run. Some survivors would later say that the roadblocks were more terrifying than the killers with machetes, because they represented a countrywide net. There was nowhere to go that was truly safe. Meanwhile, the radio continued to be the constant background noise of death. RTLM broadcasts became even more explicit, naming hiding places, telling militias where to search next. It was not just propaganda anymore, it was tactical coordination. In some areas, killers used the radio like a command center, listening for updates on where to find their next victims. And yet, despite the constant danger, there were people who found ways to survive. Some bribed their way through roadblocks with whatever they had: money, jewelry, even goats or chickens. Some forged Hutu identity cards using scraps of paper and stolen stamps. Some hid in ceilings, in wells, even in latrines for weeks on end. It is hard to imagine the mental strength it would take to stay completely silent while hearing the killer's search just outside, calling your name. There were also those who resisted in small, quiet ways. Some roadblock guards deliberately slowed down the process, letting people slip away when no one was looking. Some local officials refused to carry out orders, at great risk to themselves. Even within the militias, there were men who tried to steer attacks away from people they knew personally. These moments of defiance were rare, but they mattered. The international community was still agonizing over how to respond. The United Nations Security Council debated whether the killings met the legal definition of genocide, as though a word would make the horror more real. Peacekeepers on the ground were frustrated, watching the killings and unable to stop them. General Dallaire requested more troops, more authority to act, but what he got was more bureaucracy. Foreign journalists continued to report from Rwanda, but their coverage was often limited to areas near the capital. The full scale of the killings in rural areas was not immediately understood. When the world finally did see the mass graves and rivers full of bodies, it was already weeks too late. The Rwandan Patriotic Front continued its advance from the north, moving steadily toward Kigali. For some, the RPF was a savior, liberating towns and stopping the killings as they went. For others, particularly Hutu civilians, the advance was terrifying. Many fled before the RPF arrived, fearing revenge. The country became a landscape of refugees, with roads full of people carrying bundles, pushing bicycles loaded with whatever they could save. Daily life, for those who somehow managed to avoid being killed, became a strange mix of fear and routine. People still had to fetch water, tend to animals, cook food. The killers would pause to eat and drink, then go back to work. In some villages, there were even moments of uneasy calm between attacks, as if life was pretending to be normal. What is perhaps most haunting about this phase is how ordinary it all began to feel. When violence becomes part of the rhythm of the day, when the sound of death is as familiar as the sound of birds at dawn, it changes the very sense of what it means to be human. Some survivors later said that they stopped crying after the first few days. The horror became too constant to react to. And yet, even in those conditions, there were glimmers of hope. Stories emerged later of children who survived by hiding under piles of bodies, of mothers who shielded their children with their own bodies, of strangers who risked everything to help someone escape. These were not grand acts of heroism, but small, desperate choices made in the moment. As the weeks dragged on, Rwanda was bleeding, but the world was still hesitating. Aid organizations began to respond, but mostly by setting up refugee camps in neighboring countries for those who managed to escape. Few were coming in to stop the killing itself. It is worth pausing here to think about the sheer endurance it would take to live through this. To wake up each day knowing that you might not live to see the next sunset. To hear footsteps outside your hiding place and wonder if this was the moment it would end. To keep going, day after day, through hunger, fear, and exhaustion. As we move into the next part of this story, we will see how the genocide began to reach its terrible peak, how entire towns were wiped out, and how the RPF's advance became the only hope for an end to the killing. But before we go there, think about this. If you had been at one of those roadblocks, card in hand, would you have tried to run, to talk your way through, to bribe your way past? Or would you have simply closed your eyes and accepted whatever came next? While machetes were being sharpened and roadblocks were tightening their grip inside Rwanda, far away in the halls of power, diplomats debated words. The international response during these weeks was one of history's most sobering lessons in hesitation. The world knew what was happening. The reports were there, the images were there, yet action came slower than the killings, and often in the wrong form entirely. In New York, at the United Nations headquarters, ambassadors received cables from Kigali describing the massacres. General Romeo Dallaire sent message after message warning that what was unfolding was not just chaos, but an organized attempt to wipe out an entire population. In one particularly haunting cable, sent before the genocide even began, he warned that weapons were being stockpiled and lists of people were being prepared. He asked for permission to raid these weapons caches and stop the plan before it started. The answer he received was no. The mission's mandate was peacekeeping, not peace enforcement. When the killings started, the small contingent of UN peacekeepers found themselves caught between their orders and their conscience. Their rules of engagement were restrictive. They could fire their weapons only in self-defense. This meant that even if they watched civilians being massacred, they could not intervene unless they were directly attacked. Imagine the burden of standing there, rifle in hand, while hearing the screams and knowing you were forbidden to act. The situation became even more desperate after 10 Belgian peacekeepers were captured and killed early in the genocide. Belgium, which had once ruled Rwanda as a colonial power, was deeply shaken by the loss of its soldiers. Within days, Belgium decided to withdraw its forces entirely. Other countries followed suit. Instead of reinforcing the mission, the United Nations Security Council actually voted to reduce the number of troops in Rwanda from over 2,000 to just a few hundred at the exact moment the killings were escalating. It is one of the most criticized decisions in UN history. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, D.C., the United States government was reluctant to get involved. The memory of the failed mission in Somalia the previous year was still fresh. The images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu haunted policymakers. There was no appetite for another African intervention. Internal documents would later show that American officials deliberately avoided using the word genocide in public statements because that word would legally obligate them to act under the Genocide Convention. They chose phrases like acts of genocide instead, as though adding a single word could keep them at a safe moral distance. France's role was complex and controversial. France had been a close ally of the Hutu-led government before the genocide, providing military training and equipment. During the genocide, France eventually launched Operation Turquoise, a humanitarian mission authorized by the United Nations. French troops created a safe zone in the southwest of the country, which did save many lives, but it also allowed some of the genocide's perpetrators to escape into neighboring Zaire, where they regrouped and continued to destabilize the region for years afterward. Meanwhile, ordinary people outside Rwanda began to see images on the evening news, footage of churches full of bodies, rivers clogged with corpses. For many, it was hard to even understand what they were seeing. How could such a thing be happening in the late 20th century? Charities began raising funds, churches held prayer vigils, but still, the killing went on. There were some acts of courage on the international stage. A handful of diplomats, aid workers, and missionaries stayed behind when they could have left, sheltering people at great risk to themselves. The Red Cross continued operating ambulances, even driving through militia-controlled areas to rescue the wounded. Some journalists also stayed and kept reporting, ensuring that the world could not claim ignorance. Their dispatches, often written under gunfire, brought the reality of Rwanda into living rooms across the globe. But overall, the response was tragically slow. Every day of delay meant thousands more dead. Every debate over terminology meant more mass graves. The genocide was not a secret, it was just inconvenient. And yet, we should be careful here not to think of the international community as just a faceless machine. It was made up of individuals, some of whom fought desperately to do more, to get more troops on the ground, to push their governments to act faster. They were often blocked by politics, by bureaucracy, by fear of failure. Some broke down in tears in meetings, knowing that while they argued, people were being killed in real time. This failure would go on to reshape international policy in the years after. The idea of the responsibility to protect, which says that the world must act to stop genocide even if it means intervening in a sovereign country, was born out of the shame of Rwanda. But in those 100 days, that responsibility felt far away. For Rwandans hiding in churches, schools, marshes, and banana groves, the outside world might as well have been on another planet. Their survival depended on the strangers next door, on the mercy of someone with a gun or a machete, not on speeches given in New York or Paris. One might wonder, if you had been a policymaker then, sitting in a room with cables from Rwanda in your hands, would you have taken the risk and sent troops? Or would you have hesitated, worried about the political cost, about public opinion, about the possibility of another foreign policy disaster? By the time the genocide entered its second month, the death toll was rising so fast that it defied imagination. Hundreds of thousands of people had already been killed, and yet the killing continued as if nothing could slow it down. It is hard to describe this moment without feeling the weight of it settle in the room with you, an entire nation tearing itself apart, one machete swing at a time. One of the most haunting features of this phase was the massacres in what were supposed to be safe places, schools, churches, hospitals. These had once been sanctuaries, places where people gathered believing they would be protected. But during the genocide, many of these spaces became traps. Thousands of people fled to churches thinking the killers would respect holy ground. In many cases, local officials or priests even told people to go there, promising them safety. Once the refugees were gathered, the militias surrounded the building and attacked. There were churches where grenades were thrown through windows, where bulldozers were used to tear down the walls on top of those hiding inside. Survivors described the sound of prayers being drowned out by screams, the air thick with dust and blood. The very idea of sanctuary was turned upside down. For centuries, churches had been places of refuge. Now they became the sites of some of the worst massacres. Schools also became killing grounds. Classrooms were filled with refugees, desks pushed aside, blackboards still showing lessons from before the killings began. In some places, teachers helped identify which children were Tutsi. In others, teachers risked their lives to hide students or smuggle them out. Each place had its own moral story, some filled with betrayal, others with quiet heroism. Mass graves became common. Some were hastily dug pits near villages. Others were deeper trenches where hundreds of bodies were thrown together. There are stories of survivors who were left for dead in these graves, who clawed their way out after the killers had left. These are difficult images to hold in your mind, but they are part of understanding the scale of what happened. The killers, by this point, had settled into a rhythm. The morning might begin with drinking or singing songs that mocked the victims. Then the work of killing would begin, methodical, hour after hour. Sometimes there were pauses to eat lunch, to sharpen weapons, to check the radio for updates. It was as if death had become a routine job, something to be done with efficiency. And yet, even as the horror deepened, there were always people who resisted the tide. There were neighbors who smuggled children out of killing sites under the cover of night. There were farmers who hid entire families in grain stores or dugouts. There were Hutu women who married Tutsi men and lied to protect them, claiming their husbands were away or already dead. These acts of courage were small against the scale of the killing, but they mattered deeply to those who survived. Psychologically, this was the breaking point for many. Survivors describe living in a state where time seemed unreal. Day and night blurred together. Sleep came only in snatches, haunted by nightmares. Some stopped eating, stopped speaking, as though their bodies were shutting down to survive. And for the killers, the constant exposure to violence numbed them. Some later said they no longer felt anything as they killed. It was just something that had to be done because everyone else was doing it. This was also the period when mass rape was used as a weapon of war and genocide. Women were targeted not just to humiliate them, but to spread terror and to destroy families and communities. Many of these women were left with lasting injuries, illnesses, and trauma that would remain long after the killings stopped. It is one of the most difficult aspects of this history to confront, but it must be acknowledged because it shaped the lives of countless survivors. As the massacres continued, the Rwandan Patriotic Front was advancing, capturing more territory. With every town they took, they stopped the killings there, but they also pushed the killers into other regions, where they redoubled their efforts, almost as if trying to finish the job before the RPF could reach them. It created a grim race between death and rescue. For those hiding, every sound became a signal. A dog barking could mean someone was nearby. The distant hum of a truck could mean militias coming. The sound of gunfire could mean the RPF was close, or that the killers were clearing an area before retreating. People learned to interpret these sounds as a matter of life or death. At night, the country was eerily quiet, except for occasional shouts or cries. The smell of death hung in the air. Survivors remember covering their faces with cloth, not just to hide, but to block out the smell. Imagine living in a place where every sense, sight, sound, smell, was filled with reminders of death. The mental toll of this period cannot be overstated. Parents had to decide whether to stay together or split up to increase their chances of survival. Some hid their children with neighbors, never knowing if they would see them again. Others had to choose between running and staying with someone too weak to move. These are decisions no human should ever have to make, and yet they were made every day in village after village. Outside Rwanda, by now, the images had become impossible to ignore. News footage of churches full of bodies and fields covered with corpses began to shock the global audience. Aid organizations were calling it what it was: genocide. Pressure on governments to act was growing, but still, the killings continued largely unchecked. This was the moment when Rwanda became, for many observers, the very definition of hell on earth. And yet, it is also the moment when some of the most remarkable survival stories happened. Children walking miles through enemy territory, families hiding under floorboards for weeks, strangers risking everything to save someone else's life. As we step into the next part of the story, we will see how the RPF finally began to close in on the capital and how this advance forced a turning point that would bring the genocide to an end, but not before it left the country permanently scarred. Before we go there, pause for a moment and think about this. If you had been alive during those weeks, where would you have hidden? Would you have gone to the church, trusting it to be safe? Or would you have taken your chances running through the fields at night? By the time the Rwandan Patriotic Front reached the outskirts of Kigali, the capital was a shadow of itself. Streets that had once been busy with traders and schoolchildren were nearly empty, except for militias and bodies. The air was heavy with smoke from burning houses, and the silence was occasionally broken by bursts of gunfire or the sound of radio broadcasts still urging more killing. For those who had survived until this point, hearing that the RPF was coming was both a spark of hope and a source of new fear. Some feared that the rebels would bring revenge killings. Others saw them as the only force capable of stopping the massacres. In town after town, as the RPF advanced, the killings would suddenly stop, not because the killers had changed their minds, but because they had either fled or been defeated. The battle for Kigali itself was intense. Street by street, the RPF fought its way in, using guerrilla tactics honed over years of fighting. The militias tried to resist, but they were no match for the disciplined rebel army. Many of the government leaders who had organized the genocide fled during these days, heading toward Gisenyi and then across the border into Zaire, taking thousands of their supporters with them. This would become one of the largest refugee crises in modern history, with columns of people stretching for miles as they crossed the border. Inside Kigali, survivors began to emerge from hiding places. Some were so weak they could barely stand. They came out blinking into the light, finding that their entire neighborhoods were gone. Houses were destroyed, shops looted, streets littered with bodies. For many, the moment of liberation was almost unbearable, the relief of being alive mixed with the shock of what they were seeing. The killings did not stop everywhere all at once. In some areas, even as the RPF was taking control, militias carried out final massacres, almost as if trying to finish their task before fleeing. There are stories of entire communities being wiped out in these last hours, even as peace was just over the horizon. It gives the ending of the genocide a particularly bitter edge. Salvation was so close, and yet for many it came too late. When the RPF finally secured Kigali, the government that had orchestrated the genocide had effectively collapsed. The interim government fled across the border, leaving behind a country in ruins. But stopping the killing was only the beginning. What lay ahead was a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. Refugee camps sprang up almost overnight in neighboring countries. Some of these camps were larger than entire cities, with hundreds of thousands of people packed together under makeshift shelters. Among them were not just ordinary civilians, but also members of the Interahamwe militias and government soldiers who used the camps as bases to launch attacks back into Rwanda. This meant that the conflict did not really end. It shifted, spilling over into neighboring countries and sparking years of instability in the region. Inside Rwanda, the scale of the devastation was hard to comprehend. An estimated 800,000 people were dead. Neighbors, friends, entire families. Thousands of children were orphaned, wandering the countryside alone. Crops had been left unharvested, livestock killed, businesses destroyed. The economy had collapsed, and then there was the psychological toll. People had to learn how to live again in communities where the killers and survivors would often end up side by side. Imagine going to the market and seeing the person who had once stood at a roadblock, deciding who lived and who died. Imagine sharing a bus with someone who had taken part in a massacre. Justice was needed, but there were too many perpetrators and too few courts to handle them. The new RPF-led government faced an impossible task: rebuild a nation shattered by one of history's most efficient genocides, feed millions who were on the brink of starvation, bring justice without causing another cycle of revenge, and restore some sense of stability. International aid finally began to flow in at large scale: food, medicine, shelter. Humanitarian organizations poured into Rwanda, but there were limits to what outside help could do. Trauma was everywhere, and there were not enough counselors, doctors, or resources to address it all. This was also when the world began to truly reckon with what had happened. Journalists returned to the country and reported on the mass graves, the skulls lined up in memorials, the stories of survivors. The word genocide was now being used without hesitation. Politicians gave speeches about lessons learned, about never again. But for many Rwandans, those words must have sounded hollow. Where had this urgency been when the killings had begun? For survivors, liberation did not mean peace of mind. Many were haunted by nightmares, by survivors' guilt, by memories of what they had seen and lost. Some struggled to find meaning in continuing to live. Others threw themselves into rebuilding, determined to create a future that would never allow such violence again. The days after Kigali's fall were filled with strange juxtapositions: relief and grief, silence and the clamour of reconstruction. There were funerals everywhere, sometimes for entire families buried together. There were meetings where neighbours tried to figure out how to coexist. There were also moments of small joy: a child reunited with a surviving relative, a village planting its first new crop after months of horror, a community beginning to sing again. It is hard to say when exactly the genocide ended. For some, it ended when the last machete was dropped. For others, it has never really ended. It lives on in memory, in scars both visible and invisible. As we move forward, we will look at how Rwanda began the process of justice, how it created new systems to hold people accountable, and how the country set out to rebuild itself from the ashes. Before we go there, consider this. If you had been one of the first people to walk through Kigali after the RPF took control, seeing the empty streets, the destroyed homes, the silence, what would you have felt first? Anger, relief, grief, or simply numbness? When the guns finally went quiet and the machetes were put down, Rwanda was left standing in a silence that was almost too loud to bear. The killing had stopped, but the country was a vast graveyard. Every road, every village, every church seemed to hold a memory of death. For many survivors, the first weeks after the genocide felt unreal. You could walk through an entire neighborhood and not see a single living person. Fields were filled not with crops, but with bones. The birds, survivors later said, had stopped singing. The new RPF-led government faced an almost impossible challenge: There was no functioning state to inherit. Ministries were empty, schools were closed, hospitals were looted, and nearly every system that had once held Rwanda together had collapsed. There were too few doctors to treat the wounded, too few teachers to restart the schools, too few judges to handle the tidal wave of cases that were coming. And yet, work had to begin immediately, because a country cannot remain frozen in tragedy forever. One of the first challenges was justice. There were thousands of perpetrators, some who had killed with their own hands, some who had organized the killings, some who had given orders on the radio. How do you hold that many people accountable? How do you even begin to sort out who did what, when the entire country had been involved in some way? Rwanda's prisons quickly overflowed. Men and women accused of genocide were crammed into cells, sitting shoulder to shoulder, waiting for trials that might take decades if handled through conventional courts. The backlog was staggering. If the government tried to process every case one by one in the usual legal system, it would take over a century. That was not an option. So Rwanda turned to something deeply rooted in its own traditions: Gacaca courts. These were community-based courts that had existed for centuries as a way of resolving disputes. Under the new system, villagers would gather, hear testimony, and decide together what had happened and who was guilty. The idea was not just to punish, but to uncover the truth. People were encouraged to confess, to name others involved, to reveal where bodies were buried so families could have closure. Gacaca was not perfect. There were false accusations, grudges played out under the guise of justice, and some survivors said the process reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. But it was one of the few systems capable of dealing with crimes on such a massive scale, while also allowing communities to confront what had happened face to face. Justice was not the only priority. There were orphans to care for, widows to support, and entire villages to rebuild. Aid organizations worked alongside the new government to bring food, water, and medicine. Schools began to reopen even if classes were sometimes held under trees because there were no buildings left. The new government also had to find a way to rebuild a national identity. Before the genocide, ethnic identity cards had played a deadly role in deciding who lived and who died. Those cards were now abolished. The emphasis shifted to being Rwandan first, rather than Hutu or Tutsi. It was a radical shift in thinking, one meant to prevent future divisions from turning into violence. Economic rebuilding was another massive challenge. The country's infrastructure had been devastated. Roads were damaged, farms abandoned, markets destroyed. But slowly, Rwanda began to recover. Fields were replanted, markets reopened, and people began to trade again. It was fragile, but it was a start. The psychological rebuilding may have been the hardest of all. Survivors lived with trauma so deep it could not always be spoken about. Nightmares were common. Some people could not bear to live near those who had participated in the killings. Others sought reconciliation, believing that forgiveness was the only way forward. Rwanda began to hold commemorations each year to honor the victims, a practice that continues today. Memorials were built at sites of massacres, churches, schools, hillsides, so that the dead would not be forgotten. Internationally, Rwanda became a symbol of failure, a reminder of what happens when the world stands by. Countries that had done little during the genocide now pledged support for rebuilding. The phrase, "never again," was repeated in speeches around the world, even as other conflicts flared elsewhere, and yet Rwanda was not just a victim. It became a nation determined to chart its own future. The RPF-led government under Paul Kagame began to focus on development, on building a country that would not just survive, but thrive. In the years that followed, Rwanda would become known for its clean streets, its rapid economic growth, its focus on technology and education. But these successes cannot erase the past. They exist alongside it, a kind of living proof that a country can rise from its own ashes. For the survivors, every day was still a balancing act, between remembering and moving forward, between grief and the need to live. For some, justice brought closure. For others, it brought fresh pain. And for many, the wounds would never fully heal. As we prepare to bring this story to its conclusion, we will look at how Rwanda transformed in the decades that followed, how it turned its tragedy into a driving force for progress, how it dealt with ongoing regional conflicts sparked by the genocide, and what lessons the world has taken or failed to take from those 100 days. But for now, pause and think. If you had been one of those villagers sitting in a Gacaca court, listening to a neighbor confess to murder, could you have forgiven them? Could you have lived next door to them again, raising your children where theirs had once played? In the years following the genocide, Rwanda faced a daunting task: how to move forward after the near erasure of so much of its population and culture. The streets that once ran with blood slowly filled with life again. Markets reopened, schools resumed, and communities began the painstaking work of reconstruction. But the weight of the past lingered in every corner, in every conversation, in the faces of those who had survived. The Gacaca courts continued to function for over a decade, offering a form of community justice that was unique in modern history. Millions of cases were heard, and thousands confessed. The process was far from perfect. Some were false accusations, others were acts of revenge disguised as justice. But it allowed Rwanda to process the crimes of the genocide on a scale no conventional court could handle. Families found the burial sites of loved ones, finally giving them the dignity of proper graves. These courts forced the nation to confront its past head-on, teaching lessons in accountability, truth, and the complexities of forgiveness. Meanwhile, the government under Paul Kagame focused on rebuilding national identity and preventing further ethnic divisions. Identity cards based on ethnicity were abolished. The emphasis was shifted to being Rwandan first. Schools began teaching a new curriculum that included the history of the genocide, encouraging critical reflection and empathy. The goal was not only to educate, but to inoculate the next generation against the kind of hatred that had consumed their parents. Economically, Rwanda began an impressive transformation. Infrastructure projects rebuilt roads, bridges, and electricity grids. Investments in technology, agriculture, and tourism created jobs and helped stabilize the country. Kigali, once a city of ghostly streets, became a model for urban planning in Africa, clean, orderly, and vibrant. But development could not erase the trauma embedded in the land, in families, and in memories. Every milestone of progress existed alongside a past that demanded recognition. Socially and psychologically, the scars ran deep. Many survivors grappled with the loss of entire families, the betrayal of neighbors, and the fear that had become a constant companion during the genocide. Support systems were limited at first, but slowly NGOs, churches, and the government expanded counseling programs and survivor networks. The trauma also affected how communities interacted. Some sought reconciliation, others preferred distance, and a few struggled to forgive at all. The delicate balance between justice, healing, and coexistence became a defining challenge for the nation. Regionally, the aftermath of the genocide had repercussions far beyond Rwanda's borders. Many of the perpetrators fled to Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, creating refugee camps that became centers for renewed violence. These camps contributed to instability that would ignite further conflicts in the Great Lakes region of Africa. Rwanda itself became involved in military operations across the border to pursue genocide perpetrators and protect its borders, complicating the narrative of post-genocide recovery. Rwanda also became a focus for international reflection. Scholars, journalists, and policymakers studied the genocide extensively. Never again became a global slogan, but the reality was more complicated. Other genocides and mass atrocities would occur after 1994, showing that the lessons learned in Rwanda were often acknowledged, but not always acted upon. The world's failure during those 100 days remains a cautionary tale about hesitation, political risk, and moral responsibility. Despite the heavy past, Rwanda achieved remarkable feats. Its literacy rate increased, maternal and child mortality dropped, and its economy expanded at one of the fastest rates in Africa. Kigali became a symbol of recovery and resilience, often described as the Singapore of Africa. Yet these achievements coexist with the memory of loss, reminding the country and the world that progress does not erase history. It must be built on its acknowledgement. Memorials to the genocide remain widespread. Sites such as Nyamata, Ntarama, and Murambi preserve churches, schools, and other places where mass killings occurred, leaving them as somber reminders of human cruelty and endurance. Survivors and visitors alike walk through these spaces, confronting the reality of the past and contemplating the fragility of civilization when hatred goes unchecked. For the Rwandan people, rebuilding meant more than infrastructure. It meant reconstructing the very fabric of trust, community, and social bonds. Programs promoting reconciliation, civic engagement, and intergroup dialogue have been central to preventing future conflict. Yet the challenge remains profound. How do you rebuild a society where the horrors of neighbors turning on each other are still remembered in living memory? Rwanda today is a nation that embodies contradictions. It is a place of both remarkable recovery and deep historical trauma. Streets are clean, markets are busy, and technology hubs flourish. Yet the echo of machetes and gunfire lingers in stories passed down by survivors. It is a nation living in the shadow of its past while reaching for a future shaped by hope, stability, and vigilance. The lessons of the Rwandan genocide extend beyond its borders. They challenge the world to recognize early warnings of mass atrocities, to act decisively when faced with evidence of systematic violence, and to understand that ordinary people can be both perpetrators and heroes depending on the circumstances and pressures they face. The genocide also teaches about resilience, how humans can survive, adapt, and rebuild even when faced with unimaginable horror. As you reflect on this history, think about what it means to live in a world where the ordinary can be turned into instruments of violence, and where survival can depend on courage, resourcefulness, and sometimes luck. Rwanda's story is not just about death, it is about life, perseverance, and the painstaking effort to create order, justice, and meaning from chaos. And so, the 100 days of the genocide may have ended in July 1994, but the consequences echo through time. Rwanda stands today as a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. It reminds us that history is not merely a record of the past, but a mirror reflecting the choices we face as individuals and societies in moments of moral crisis. Before we end this story, pause for a moment. Imagine walking through Kigali today, knowing what happened just decades ago, seeing people go about their daily lives in the same streets where chaos once ruled. Could you reconcile the horrors of the past with the vibrancy of the present? How do we, as a global community, ensure that history's darkest chapters are not repeated? Rwanda's journey from the ashes is both a warning and an inspiration. The past is never forgotten, yet it has been transformed into a force that shapes a nation determined to endure, rebuild, and teach the world the price of silence, fear, and inaction.